Good evening, everybody. We ready to start? Okay, great. Well, let's call the meeting to order and begin with roll call. I'll call out your name and just say here or not here. Nicholas Acevedo. Dennis Baker. Here. Curtis Black. Here. Matthew Brady. James Carlson. Here. Jeff Cefalia. Okay. Ann Clarity. Susan DeSantis. Jeremy Evans, he's coming any minute. He's in the parking garage. Arlene Greer here. David Gooder. Okay. Lynn Hackman. Laird Hayes. Okay. Charles Globe. Okay. Ruth Kobayashi. Excused absence. Scott Laidlaw. Okay. Katie Love. Anthony Maniscalchi. Thomas Meng. Jim Mosher. Maxwell Pearson. Robert Rader. Excused absence. Harrison Rolfs. Nancy Scarborough. Amber Snyder. Debbie Stevens. Graham Wahlberg. Not here. Okay. Christy Walker. Paul Watkins. Lori Williams. Okay, great. All right. Public comments on non-agenda items. Mr. Mosher?
Thank you, Chair Greer. The second meeting of the Noise Element Subcommittee happened yesterday, and since it was too late to get on the agenda, I've been asked to give a brief report as a non-agenda, non-discussion item. Although it is not in DUDEC's contract, we're expecting a memo from their acoustic engineer critiquing our current noise element, but in the absence of any further guidance from the consultant, our committee is attempting to follow the state-mandated guidelines for creating city and county noise programs. For those unfamiliar, the purpose of a noise element is to identify the current and anticipated sources of noise and the uses most sensitive to them, and to ensure that we have strategies to guide land use development that will improve the areas that need improvement and protect the areas where we do not yet have a problem. We're still in the very early stages of a multi-step process, and the step we're currently working on is to compile and review the noise complaints received by the city, which is something we hope will be supplemented by outreach to learn the noise concerns of the public in general, including those who may have never thought to complain. Specifically, on Tuesday, we heard from a senior code enforcement officer within our community development department who reported that the most frequent complaints that department receives are for construction noise, followed by air conditioning equipment and short-term lodgings. She also helped us identify the other city departments that may receive complaints about noise, such as the police, including their animal control department, Park Patrol, Harbor, special event coordinators, and it occurs to me, maybe even Public Works. Not to mention the airport, which is separate from the city and receives 300 to 500 noise complaints a day from Newport Beach addresses. At our next meeting, which will hopefully be before the next GPAC meeting, which is why I'm giving the report tonight, we are hoping to get further details, including the numbers and locations and such things as the breakdown of the construction complaints between those that are for noise outside the allowed hours versus excessively loud noise during the allowed hours. And we also hope to be able to hear DUDEC's critique of our current noise programs. In addition, we hope to educate ourselves about the technical terminology that is used in the noise enforcement industry and to better understand ourselves how our current standards are being applied to the complaints and to decide if they constitute an enforceable violation or not. We're also looking forward to the next critical step that is supposed to take place before tackling policy issues, and that is to paint a quantitatively accurate picture of the city's soundscape that is producing the current noise complaints and what that soundscape will look like quantitatively at the end of our planning horizon. That requires having people to measure and predict the sound levels currently in the city and to predict what those will be in the future. And since the budgeting for that seems to have been overlooked in the planning of the current general plan update, we're not entirely sure how that's happening or going to, but I'm reasonably sure it will, either through DUDEC or possibly through another firm that our city manager has on call to analyze airport noise issues. And so that's my report for now. And for those interested, yesterday's meeting for the first time was recorded. So those unable to attend can, I think, will have an opportunity to review it. And the minutes should be posted as soon as Ben gets a chance to work that into his very busy schedule. So that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Mosier, for your noise update. And Ben, you have something to report as well.
Yes, just very briefly, I'd like to report that there have been 2 resignations from the GPAC, and so what we'll see is a notice of vacancies posted. Matthew Brady has resigned, as well as Graham Wahlberg. So just want to report that for the GPAC. You now have 28 members officially, so we will be working on filling those vacancies from here. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay,
I have a
we'll be
comment,
moving.
Arlene. Can I
Oops, Nancy. Yes,
Sorry.
of course.
didn't
Thank
wave.
you. Yes, please go.
wave
Okay.
fervently enough? I went to the pop-up at the Battle of the Bay, or in the Bay, and while I was there, it was, first of all, I thought it was very well attended, and sounds like it was a successful pop-up. They had these business cards there, and I think that those should be made available to all of us. For example, I was in a city council meeting this last week where a resident who lives on the peninsula and witnessed the event where the young woman was hit by the drunk driver and killed. She was there, and she made a plea to the council to review all of the sidewalk crossings on the peninsula and the stop signs for lighted sidewalks and stop signs. We did not talk about that in the safety element, but if I'd had a card with me, it would have been good, and I did have one card. It was sitting on my dresser, I'm sorry. But if I'd had a stack of these and carrying them around, I could have given this to her and said, go here and make your comment online. And I don't know her name. I still have to research it. I'll get to her. But I think that those kinds of things do happen, and if we had these available, I think we could do a little bit of outreach just randomly. Thank you.
Thank you, Nancy. Any other public comment on non-agenda items before we move on? Ben, do you have anything to say about that?
No, we can coordinate with Cairns and West as well as the outreach subcommittee to make sure that we're distributing those cards, because we do have those available. We also have larger pamphlet brochures, but I don't think you want to carry those around. So.
Maybe we'll get T-shirts next month too. Right. Okay. Yes, Mr. Betancourt.
Forgive me. The County of Orange has their own general plan update and outreach process underway, and I belong to a number of tribes, so we've got mailings already. I wondered at some appropriate time, could the staff discuss how the city will participate, if at all, in that process, given the Newport Banning Ranch is the largest of the unincorporated areas? Thank you.
Thank you, Phil. Any comment? No comment. Any other comments? Okay. All right, let's move on to current business. Meeting minutes of the April 30th, 2024 meeting. Any comments, revisions? Okay, we have Mr. Mosier's written comments, and then I believe that I was the person who abstained from the minutes last meeting, not Jeremy. So that needs to be noted. Okay, all right. And may I have a motion to approve the minutes as presented with one revision?
I'll move the minutes with Mosher's comments.
Okay, thank you. And second? Oh, Katie Love, second. All in favor? Aye. Opposed? None? Okay. I'm going to turn the meeting over to Jeremy now.
Okay. How's everybody doing? Good. All right. Next item on the agenda, Section 4, Subsection B, Land Use Subcommittee Recap. There is an attachment in the packet. Once I find the page number, I will share that. But I'm going to turn it over to the Land Use Chairperson to give their report.
First is Elizabeth. So, sorry, I'm not the chairperson, but we're going to turn it over actually to Elizabeth with Dudek to provide a quick overview, and then we'll get to Chair DeSantis for the subcommittee report.
All right, thank you. Hi, everyone. I'm Elizabeth Dixon. I'm a planner with Dudek. So actually, before we dive into land use, I have promised a few of you that I would give an overview in more detail of the contents of the general plan. And given that we're really approaching the end of phase 1 of our general plan update process, before we dive into phase 2, I want to be sure that we kind of go through that at a high level. I do have a lot of slides today because we are also going into the land use, safety, and harbor and bay analyses, as well as an outreach update. So I'll keep things quick and keep things moving, but I know some of you have asked for this, and I think the time is right. So with that, let's dive right in. So first, starting at a high level, what is a general plan? I think most of you are familiar with this, but I don't think there's any reason not to start from the beginning. So this is a long-range policy document to guide future actions over the next 20 to 30 years. So if you look at your adopted general plan, it establishes a vision out to the year 2025. So that's really one of the reasons that we're updating the general plan. A general plan preserves and enhances community strengths and addresses topics of concern. It creates a process where the community can come together and develop a shared vision for the future. So we're really thinking long-term here, thinking about the future of Newport Beach. And then, of course, as I think most of you know, the general plan is required by state law. There are some specific elements that are required. There's also the option for optional elements that are important for each jurisdiction. The general plan contains a vision statement, goals, policies, and implementation measures. And those are developed in response to community needs and aspirations. So through our outreach with you, with the broader community and any other stakeholders, that's where we will develop that vision statement, those goals, policies, and those implementation measures. And what you see is through that process, and what's displayed on this graphic is that through that implementation is where you start to see change within the community. All right, so I want to give you a breakdown of each of these key components. So starting with a vision statement, which I know that we've gone in depth on the vision statement, but just as a little recap, the vision statement is a shared image for the future of the community. So we're really thinking, what do we want Newport Beach to be in 20 to 30 years? It reflects community values, needs, and aspirations. And then it guides the development of the general plan goals and policies. So we discussed this before. This is our North Star as we develop the general plan. The goals. Goals, there are several throughout each element. These are an ideal end state. So these get a little bit more tailored. They're tearing off that vision statement, but they are really reflecting an outcome that we want to achieve. And they ultimately act to establish that policy direction. So under each goal, you're going to have policies. And those policies are the statements that guide decision making. We're going to get into a little more detail on what that means and how those are really used in practice, but they guide actions and decision makings. Policies range from general to specific. And generally, they start with verbs. If that interests you, that's something that we'll be focused on through this. Getting into the implementation. So today, as your implementation program is adopted and is a common practice, it has a series of actions and tools to implement the general plan. So the tools are the mechanisms at the city's disposal that they can use to carry out those actions. So we think about things like the zoning code, specific plans, interagency coordination. I have a few examples here, and these are from your adopted implementation program. When we think about how we use those to carry out actions, those actions are the statement tied to each of those policies. So, for example, with a specific plan, you would develop a specific plan for the residential village proposed for the airport area. This is paraphrased, but it is in your adopted implementation program. For interagency coordination, an example would be to coordinate with school districts to seek joint use facility agreements. So that means that there's the schools' parks that they have would be open for public access, basically. All right, so how this all lays out, and this is all examples from your adopted general plan. These are paraphrased because there's a lot of text here. But starting with the vision statement, in your current vision statement, we have outdoor recreation space for active local and tourist populations that highlight the city's environmental assets, as well as indoor facilities for recreation and socializing. So how do we start to envision that as a goal? The provision of adequate park and recreation facilities that meet the recreational needs of existing and new residents of the community. All right, tearing down from there, a policy that would be aligned with that goal would be update the park fee assessed to new residential development in lieu of dedicating parkland on a regular basis. So this policy has two actions tied to it. It is to, its development fees will be evaluated annually, and requirements for parkland dedication improvements or the provision of in lieu fees shall continue to be implemented. So then what does that look like in action? In action, this isn't in your general plan. This is what has happened over the years. In 2020, the city adopted an adjustment to the park fees pursuant to an appraisal of property. So just so you're kind of seeing where we're starting, we really are looking high level. We're looking at that big picture for the next 20 years, but there are very specific actions that are meant to be taken over those 20 years, or 30, 20 to 30, we'll get there. All right, so a couple of high level things. General plans should establish land use and development patterns. They should establish long-term direction, and they should set the stage for implementation. General plans should not solve every issue facing the city today. And what I mean by that is that the city has decisions before them today. They're going to have decisions before them next month. And we're not here to guide that process. We're here to really think forward, because if we start to try through this process to weigh in on current decisions that are being made, that's when we start to create a silo in existing city processes, because the city has their own process for receiving public input on decisions that are being made. But if we start using the general plan to try to guide those decisions, then we risk getting opposition to our process and really doing a disservice to the process as a whole. We don't want the general plan to be overly specific. Now, I did state that policies they will be general and specific. There's nuance and specificity. So one example is that the way your land use element is set up today is that you have specific unit counts tied to some parcels, right? That may feel really overly specific, but one thing to note with that is that's a maximum threshold. It's not saying this is the exact amount. So when you start to think about, we don't want to be overly specific, I think thinking about how do we set some ranges for flexibility. And then the general plan should not enforce policies or override existing laws. So that's where, again, it sets the stage for implementation, but it does not enforce those policies. So the general plan, it doesn't act as a checklist at the end of the day. The council is really using the general plan as they're making decisions. They're referencing it along the way. And so that gets into this last piece, who uses the general plan and how. The primary users of the general plan are the city council, the Planning Commission, and city staff. City Council and Planning Commission, as I stated, they use the general plan to guide their decision-making. So the council has priorities throughout their term, and the general plan is what they should really be looking to as specific decisions are coming before them. Same thing with city staff. City staff, they of course do staff reports and things like that to bring forward to Planning Commission and City Council, and that's where they defer to the general plan to help guide their own recommendations. And then finally, the community uses the general plan. The community can use the general plan to provide input to decision makers, and then also to understand what the citywide values and direction is. All right, so with that, I do have these slides, but I want to take a pause here to see if there are any questions.
This may be something that you would go away and bring back to us. Is there any legal relationship? I mean, the charter's our constitution. We have laws and zoning and stuff that supports that. If there were legal concerns, or are there examples of where there are legal concerns that have come up regarding general plans, whether ours or another city or something like that? Like somebody said, hey, okay, we went through all this work to do the general plan, and you all are kind of ignoring it or something like that. Does it have any legal standing?
Yes, that's a good question. So I think one good example of that is that legally you want to, there could be consequences to not having consistency between your general plan and zoning, for example. So your land use and your zoning, there could be legal consequences to that. The law is a little bit different with charter cities, but it is codified that consistency is important. So that could, if there's a conflict between your general plan land use and your zoning, then there could be some legal concerns when it comes to a development application, for example. Building on that, there is a lot of law tied to general plans when it comes to what should be contained in a general plan. And we actually will get into more detail on that at our next GPAC meeting in July, because we're going to be going over the diagnostic memo. And what you'll find is that aside from the housing element, which we're not updating through this process, that's gone through a separate process, as you're aware, the safety element is one of the most highly regulated elements of the general plan.
Okay. Any other comments? Please, Jim.
Yeah, thank you. Elizabeth, you mentioned that we're looking forward to a certain date, and specifically for the land use element, one of the requirements is actually to project that the noise contours that will be expected at the horizon year, it's called, of the general plan, the final year. And the county, for instance, their general plan is being called Orange County Plan 2050, so apparently they're looking forward to 2050. And you've mentioned we may be looking forward 20 or 30 years. At some point we have to actually, I think, decide on a date. So how and when are we going to choose our horizon year?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. So we've got a few things that we've got coming up when we really enter phase 2. I'm working right now with my team, with city staff, with Kearns and West. We're starting to decipher a lot of the outreach and input that we've received to date, so that we can ultimately put together a workshop that we envision for this GPAC. And I think that that's one of the topics that we'll be going over.
Thanks, Jim. All right. Anybody else? Okay. So we've received that report. Well, her report. Right. Well, you're still going. We're not ready for Nancy yet.
I can move us into land use.
Okay.
And
Perfect.
then I'll pass it over to Susan to give the report out. All right, thank you so much. Okay, perfect. Well, I'll keep us moving. All right, next we're going to go over the land use element analysis. And we did meet with the land use element subcommittee, and we're recapping some of that conversation here. So just a high-level overview, the land use element is one of the required general plan elements. It's required by state law. It identifies the location and extent of the planned use of land, so planned land uses. Sometimes you'll find that what is on the ground today is not exactly what's been planned, but that's why we plan. It addresses housing, businesses, industry, open space, education, public facilities, and more. And it shows the extent and intensity of uses. So that could be density when you're thinking in terms of residential uses or floor area ratio, or in the city's case, it can even be very specific unit count maximums. The currently adopted element aims to maintain Newport Beach as a primarily residential community, promote a diversity of uses to support the needs of residents, enhance the economy, protect the environment, and serve visitors. And I am paraphrasing here, so if you are very familiar with this element, this doesn't touch on every single thing. It aims to protect and enhance areas so that there are complementary development patterns and balanced design with the environment. I felt like that was one thing that really stood out as something that has been important through the adopted element. The background analysis analyzes the current land use. This is both existing and planned use of land, applicable regulations, issues and opportunities, and then potential considerations. So through the discussions with the subcommittee, here are some key things that we touched on. There's an interest in utilizing specific plans to help create connectivity and a mix of uses in areas planned for change. Specifically, there's interest in a specific plan in the airport area. And there was also some conversation about how providing a balanced mix of uses can help retain sales tax dollars within Newport Beach. There's a conversation on transfer of development rights. Through existing transfer of development rights programs, there's the ability to retain existing commercial capacities. So this was really in relationship to the housing element overlays. That commercial capacity still exists, and there's opportunity to capture some of that. Offices are said to be underutilized, specifically in the airport area, and there may be opportunities for adaptive reuse. There was also a conversation that adaptive reuse doesn't make sense in today's market, but we're also thinking 20 plus years in the future. So it doesn't mean that we can't have policies in place to support something like that. There was conversation about the planning sub-areas, and this was brought up by Dudek's team within the adopted land use element today. There are identified geographic areas that through the last general plan were identified to be areas of change, but we see opportunities to identify geographic areas across the city so that we can tailor policies that make sense to neighborhoods and areas that the community's familiar with. A few things to consider if there are changes in land use. Community input, of course, is one of those key things. There are constraints to development from both the airport and the coastal zone. If we are considering land use changes, we also need to consider the availability of resources and the cost of supportive infrastructure. So this could influence where and the types of land use changes that we would consider. And then maintaining those identified housing sites. And this is really tied to the housing element, which we're not changing through this process in any way. And then finally, there was a robust conversation about density bonus units and housing development limits. And this was really not something that was assessed within the analysis, but it's a broader conversation that was important for the committee. And I'm actually going to pass things over to Susan because I know that she's going to report out and give us a little more context there.
Susan. And this is on page 17 for folks who are following along on the packet.
Thank you. So How's that? Okay. So we had a very good turnout for our land use subcommittee meeting and a very robust conversation. And you did an excellent job in laying out the background that was presented. And under this, on this slide here with the subcommittee considerations, a lot of the major discussion that we had revolved around these issues. So the idea of doing specific plans was an important idea that was very highly supported by the subcommittee, and it included both the airport area as well as Newport Center and Fashion Island as two areas where community input was important. And that the specific plans should be strongly supported within the general plan for these two areas and possibly for some of the other targeted development areas within the housing overlay zones. I don't think that's there yet. And we also talked about the fact that within the general plan itself, that the committee could provide guidance that goes beyond what's there now for these specific areas. So we have a limited time in which to work on the general plan. And Jaime did tell us that it will be a priority for the city to move forward on the specific plans as soon as possible. But in the interim, we may want to be looking at creating some goals and policies for those areas that could be incorporated into the general plan. The other area that I wanted to talk about, and you know, I do think this is a bit of a challenge. I appreciated your distinctions between what is in the separate process going on with the land use element and the housing overlay zones and the development and the vote that's going to take place in November. But it does focus on the key growth areas within the city, and it is a challenge to do a general plan update and take those off the table. And that's really where the issue of density bonus units and the housing development limits comes to play, because there is a significant difference in the fair share housing numbers that the city required and what the overall unit count would be with the density bonus units and however you calculate those housing development limits. So that's why the committee discussed those items. We understand what you said. I'm just pointing out the dilemma that it creates in trying to move forward with the general plan and to have that as a limitation. So perhaps through the idea of the specific plans and being able to, in the near term, provide some policy guidance and some specific objectives, we may be able to do some important work there. But I would say that that's probably the most important aspect of what we talked about. I would also suggest that community input was talked about at length, and the importance of making sure that whatever we are putting in front of the community does reflect the community input. So I'm going to leave it at that. There's more detail in the report that is in your meeting packet, but I think I would open it up to the other committee members who might have something specific that they would like to add.
Thank you, Susan. Charles, please.
Hi there, this is probably for staff. At what stage are we at today with the council approving the land use element and the decisions about sending it to a vote? My understanding is that the Planning Commission has approved it. Has the City Council?
No, so the matter is scheduled to come before council July 23rd.
Okay, and at that meeting, they will approve the land use element as it's currently been as submitted to ALUC, and the decision will be made at that point to put it on the ballot, or has that already been decided?
Right now, staff is preparing a draft resolution to bring it to a consolidated municipal election with a ballot.
Okay.
We'll see what happens on July 23rd.
Okay.
Thanks, Charles. Anybody else? Yes.
In bringing and thinking of the focus areas around the airport and then Coyote Canyon, around the airport, my question is, how does the city interact with the areas where there's a sphere of influence like Irvine, and how you're planning the community, say, for example, to plan the availability of more grocery stores, which there's not really existing up there around the airport right now, with the exception of like the Irvine market on campus, and then going to Irvine to get the groceries. How do we as a city of Newport Beach interact with a community that is our sphere of influence to make sure we're not duplicating in our processes what they already have planned in theirs? How do you sort that out? Like, say, for example, a grocery store in Irvine on the edge of our sphere of influence wouldn't serve them or us very well if there were two in a close area. How do we work with our sphere of influence? How do we become aware of what's going on?
Ben?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think a lot of it has to do with private market and demand. Obviously, as Elizabeth mentioned in the presentation, there's a desire to retain sales tax money and revenue for the city. So it obviously would not serve the city very well to have Newport Beach residents traveling to Irvine and spending money there for their services and supportive services. But I would say that there's probably not a very well orchestrated coordination on those types of services, because a lot of times those types of retail establishments will not require documents that would come to the city of Newport Beach for review. For example, like an environmental impact report, we do get notified of work that Irvine or Costa Mesa is doing, but I don't believe that something like that would come to our attention, and I don't know that the city would oppose it necessarily. Rather, I think that we, as Elizabeth put, might want to consider policies moving forward to support those types of residents supporting services in the city.
Do we interact with our developers? So they obviously have a plan, because they do so much development, in the Orange County area. Say, for example, the Irvine company. Do they have something in their general plan that we reference, in order to be able to plan for, in our city, for essential services like having grocery stores available and other, retail?
So I would say that developers might have master plans that we're not privy to, but it's kind of a cart before the horse issue, where you don't want to plan for a grocery store before you have residents there to actually patronize that store. So I would assume that if you build it, they will come, sort of a thing. But we don't have anything in our in that we're aware of where there's a grocery store coming online in the airport area, for example. But again, to the point, perhaps there's a specific plan that could support that sort of a use specifically.
I just think they're so great at planning everything that, sure that we could use a few tips.
Thank you. I'm just going to go to Susan real quick, please.
All right, I did want to, you also mentioned Coyote Canyon. And
About that trust, I'm reading about a trust. What is that all about?
okay, well, we talked about the fact that Coyote Canyon, the property, a large portion of it, is owned by the county and is within a conservation area. But it is being leased to the developer who wants to build a golf course there and seems to be interested in looking at housing, residential development possibilities. So the idea was, since a major component of housing cost is land cost, that perhaps the city could be leased to a developer to develop affordable housing, perhaps an all-senior project among other residential development that takes place. So it was an idea that we also thought might be in partnership with the Housing Trust Fund, as well as some of the other major employers within Newport Beach, like Hoag Hospital, who may be interested in supporting it and being a partner for their workers to be able to live closer to work, as well as the city employees and things like that. So it was just an idea that appears to be one that could be worth looking into.
Thanks, Susan. Thanks, Arlene. Please.
Testing. Chuck Fancher, I'm a Newport Beach resident. I don't sit on Susan's land use committee, but this discussion prompts a thought I'd like to share with her committee and with your larger committee. You know, the land use element seems to focus on physical topics, geographical, physical types of uses, where, when, and when not. And I think that it would be well if our city, as it could be reflected possibly in a general plan update policy under land use, could speak to that we want our city to function in a way when it is considering change in its environment and in its land use and in its built environment, that it establish a policy that it needs to be done not expedited, but in a reasonable time frames without burden of unnecessary time requirements on the process. Because I will, what is maybe knowledgeable to everyone in this room is that one thing that kills change is to have a path that is too difficult to take on the change and try to attempt change, whether that's building a house or building a golf course or building affordable housing. And I would suggest that a policy statement on fair and equitable resolution of questions, in a way that is, I don't know the words. Susan's committee could think of the words, but so that we're not creating unnecessary constraints to change by our own process.
A good point. Thank you. Please, Debbie.
It was on? Okay, yeah, I hear myself. So real quick comment on the land, or this airport area. The city of Irvine also has a RENA number, and that RENA number is 22,000 as compared to our 4,800. And to hit their 22,000-ish number, they're looking at like 50,000 units. We happen to share the airport area with the city of Irvine, and you can imagine that they're looking at dumping housing there too. I have no solution, but I'm just wondering if there's any chance during the specific plan to coordinate a little bit with them to see what they're doing. And obviously it's two different jurisdictions, so you don't have to. But it's kind of eye-opening what the airport area could look like.
Thanks, Debbie. Dennis, please.
I know that the housing and all the things we're talking about are the big elephant in the room on the land use. Where do things like marine serving services, tourist serving services, are those, because I haven't attended the land use, are those items, I would assume those items also need to be part of that element? And maybe they are, and maybe you've already covered it. But I haven't heard anything about it.
I can take that one. So we are also going to cover the Harbor and Bay element analysis, and one of the primary considerations of the Harbor and Bay element are the uses within the area of land, because those uses are reliant on the harbor and lay. And yes, even though they're land use. So it can be a little bit confusing, but because those uses are so reliant on the harbor and bay, and tourism is so reliant on the harbor and bay, we actually, I have a full slide on economics even tied to that one, so we'll dive into that one as well.
Okay. So, in going forward, if things are going to come up regarding that, it's actually going to be in those elements. And this is where we've talked about this before, how the elements cross over and intertwine and stuff like that. And this is an example of that. Okay.
Absolutely. This is an example of that, where the planned land use, it has to be consistent, whether it's in harbor and bay or the land use element. And if we are identifying land use changes, we will do that in the land use element, but we will be considering the land uses that are reliant or there because of the harbor and bay.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Thanks, Dennis. Anybody else? Oh, Jim, please.
Yeah, regarding the background report, one of the usual things covered in such background reports for land use element is documenting the current land uses, what the current built environment is. And I notice in the revision here, that would come under existing conditions, section 5.1 development. It's on handwritten pages 76 and 77 of the report. And in the initial report, there was a tallying of this, which now looks like it's been crossed out. And I understand, I don't know where this information came from. I think it's being crossed out because it was found to be inaccurate. However, I would point out that in our current implementation plan, I think there was a directive for our city staff to develop and keep current a database of what current land uses are in the city, what the existing built environment is. And I think they put some effort into that, so they may have accurate data. So is the background report at some point going to be updated with accurate data for what we currently have built in the city? That's the question. I'm not sure DUDEC has to duplicate what the city staff has already done, but perhaps the two of you have to talk, and perhaps the committee has to actually see what the current environment is.
Thanks, Jim. Any comments, Elizabeth, on that, or no?
Yeah, the data that we've put in there with the update is based on 2019 assessor parcel data. That's the data that we had access to. The data that was previously reflected, it's coming from a third-party source. I think it was just causing more confusion than anything, because when you look at land use from a built data perspective, it's not always going to have the city's land use designation. So then it causes some confusion because the way things are referenced gets a little bit fuzzy. So that's why I've incorporated those revisions, and what you'll see within those revisions is that there are now just 2 maps, and I'm not quantifying them from that land use perspective. It's only quantified from a planned land use perspective, but not an existing land use development perspective. And the 2 that I have are, we're looking at residential uses. And so the data that I have, it doesn't calculate number of units, but it does categorize based on typology, which looks at things like single unit attached, single unit detached, 2 to 4. So it gives you some indication of where existing densities lie. And then with every other built use, it's been collectively put together. And what I have for those built uses in terms of data is only the square footage of what's on the ground. It doesn't capture the square footage of an entire structure, but it still indicates intensity to the extent possible. But that's all the data that I have.
Thanks, Elizabeth.
Yeah, I understand that. I think, though, for the information of the committee, it doesn't really matter what the source is, whether it comes from DUDEC or the city staff. So perhaps we could be updated on whether the city staff has an accurate database of how much commercial property we have, how much residential property, and so forth.
Yes, just to clarify, I think the purpose of the information it's serving different purposes. So for the backgrounds condition report, we're just trying to illustrate what the different types of existing land uses are. The land use database that we've been working on with Dan Campanello in our GIS system is really intended to track development limits within our general plan. So we have an accurate count of dwelling units and non-residential square footage, but it's not broken down by the different types of land uses. And so we're not really able to combine the two types of information. They're really serving two different purposes.
Thank you, Jim. Thank you, Elizabeth. Okay, so we've received the overview of the GPAC Land Use Subcommittee report. Thank you, Susan. Thank you, Elizabeth. We've got some feedback. Now we'll just receive and file attachment 2, which in summary talks about the density bonus units, and they're going to continue to guide initial outreach efforts. So with that, we will move on to subsection C, Harbor and Bay Subcommittee. The materials will appear on page 107 in your packets. And I will turn it over to Elizabeth again, and then to Chair Black.
Perfect. Thank you so much. All right. So moving along, the Harbor and Bay element analysis. I'll give you a little bit more context on this one, but similarly, we're going to cover some of those key topics of discussion that we had with the subcommittee. So a high-level overview, this is an optional element. So this is not mandated under state law, but this is something that was identified as being important through your general plan, and has some really important aspects that are still relevant to Newport Beach. So the adopted element addresses economics in terms of marine-related uses, activities, support facilities, as well as commercial uses that are along or dependent upon the water. So there are a lot of uses that exist there today that cannot be relocated because they exist because of the water. It addresses recreation in terms of boating, kayaking, public spaces along the water. I know there was a question about surfing. It addresses windsurfing. So that's one of the other things that's included there. Natural resources, ecosystems, water quality, marine life. You're seeing, of course, these are already elements of the general plan, but this is where it's specific to the Harbor and Bay. And then community character, such as coastal access, entertainment uses, design, and visual resources. So our analysis takes a deeper dive into land use, economics, recreation and public access, as well as natural resources. So one of the things that I did want to go into a little bit of detail on is economics within Newport Harbor. And Newport Harbor, of course, is the water itself, but the map here is showing where what the area this analysis is really covering, because we're looking at the use of land. So the economics within the harbor creates $787 million in annual economic output. That's both direct and indirect. 11% of total jobs in the city. So job growth in the harbor is faster than the county as a whole, but it's not quite as fast as the city as a whole. 50% of jobs in Newport Harbor exist because of the harbor. So again, this goes back to those harbor-dependent uses. Employment in the maritime commercial industry declined between 2019 and 2020, but it's possible that that could be due to technological advances. And then lower commercial and industrial land values create market pressure to convert to residential land uses because that land can be captured at a lower rate to recapture that value through residential uses. So this is something that's been touched on pretty heavily through the adopted Harbor and Bay element, and that's because the previous element identifies the importance of maintaining those uses. So if that's something that's still important to the community, that's why we've conducted this economic analysis. There was interest in understanding more in terms of economics related to tax revenues, but that's not something that we've assessed through that. And this is what that covers. So to kind of respond to some of those questions. And so through our conversation with the Harbor and Bay Element Subcommittee, there has been really an ongoing theme through a lot of these for increased internal communication. This was specific to internal communication between the Harbor Commission and the Parks, Beaches, and Recreation Department. Some members felt that beaches were not really getting enough attention. There's also, we've discussed this in other settings, but there's a desire to rename the element to Harbor, Bay, and Beaches element to help increase that emphasis. There was a discussion about tourism really being driven by the beach and balance between supporting tourism versus expanding tourism compared to maintaining community character. So if we are thinking in terms of land use changes, these are things that we need to consider along the way. And then, of course, an ongoing topic through so much of the work that we've been doing is related to coastal needs, such as sea level rise planning. So there was an identification for the need for a sea level rise plan. There is currently a sea level rise assessment. There is new state law in place that requires a sea level plan be created. And for those who complete theirs early, there will be prioritization in terms of funding for infrastructure. Beach nourishment continues to come up as a topic of conversation, and of course, natural solutions versus hard armoring along all the coast. There's been conversation around how do we prioritize those things. A discussion about vulnerability of existing and planned infrastructure, as well as public access, and then also concerns with insurance. So as there are hazards, and this really ties to safety as well, but we're seeing trends with insurance companies who are leaving areas. So that's certainly a topic of concern. So with that, I am going to pass it along to Curtis. Thank you.
Thank you. I think you covered most of it, honestly. I think that was a really good background. We spent most of the meeting reviewing this background here. And then I guess a few other additional kind of pieces of color on the conversation and kind of where we focused. There was definitely a discussion of what's changed from 2006 to now. And you know, one of the observations was the 2006 general plan had a really specific goal and policy calling for an evaluation of the delineation of responsibility in the harbor between the city, the state, the county, and that clearly was a focus that led to the creation of the Harbor Commission. You know, the Harbor Commission's obviously been a big part of our city today, and so there was a second conversation towards the end of this meeting that we should do some outreach specifically to the Harbor Commission. So we're trying to get on their agenda to go and kind of put in their court, kind of been asked to see what goals and policies they would want to see in an updated general plan. We did a similar meeting with the Water Quality Coastal Tidelands Committee because there's a lot of scope overlap in that committee, and they're creating a subcommittee to kind of provide some suggestions back to us on what they'd want to see included in the plan. And then I think there was probably like a 15-minute conversation on the economic impact and how it's, you know, we don't have a delineation there between what's driven by the harbor and by the beaches, but it's clear that there's a huge impact that our beaches bring. It's also clear that some of these optional elements place value on certain aspects of our community, and that's where the conversation emerged around potentially calling this element harbor, bay, and beaches, and being very clear that that's a value statement for us and our committee. And then there was a downstream conversation from that on, potentially looking at how we structure some of our committees and commissions in the city. Beaches fall between 3 different committees and commissions right now. It's definitely a lack of ownership over, who owns the vision, who owns the policies and the plans. So that also came up. And then, let me see if there's anything else. You mentioned kind of the conversations around coastal and bluff erosion. There were also some interesting conversations that I think came up through your outreach on how affordability in the harbor has changed from a recreational and a boating perspective, which I think is interesting because the 2006 general plan clearly calls for maximizing the economic value of the harbor and things like mooring slots. So maybe perspectives have changed over 20 years. But I think that covers it, and I thought it was a good background report, and definitely worth looking through if you haven't already.
Thanks, Curtis. Any questions, comments on that? I thought you guys did a great job. I love adding the beach element too. That's nice. So appreciate that. James, you have something?
Yeah, can we bring that to vote to add the beaches? That was kind of the outcome of the whole thing.
Absolutely. If somebody wants to make a motion, right? Yeah. We'll bring it. Yeah.
I think that'll see its way through the process, but I think through the action of simply receiving and file, you're expressing concurrence with the recommendations therein.
That's what we did with the arts and culture. It was already in the report.
I'll support it. All righty. Well, thank you both for that. That was fantastic. So we've received and heard that report, and we will accept that and file that and continue with their outreach efforts and get some more feedback from them and have a vote potentially for next meeting in July. Move to subsection D. This is on the back page, page 4, Safety Subcommittee Recap. The attachment can be found on page 217. We're going to go to Elizabeth first and then to Chair Scarborough.
All right, thank you. And we're moving along really quickly. So let's see. So we're going into the safety element analysis now. Again, it's a very similar format to what I've shown you. And I'm not going to take you into all the detail because when it comes to all of the topics of safety, there's a lot. Some of it we have addressed in terms of resilience, but I actually feel like some of you may agree that this is one of the drier analyses to read, but some of you may also agree that this is one of the easier ones to read because it's very data focused and there's a lot of graphics in there. So hopefully that helps. But the safety element is a required element of the general plan. And as I mentioned earlier, it is one of the elements that is most heavily regulated under state law. The analysis analyzes environmental hazards. So we're looking at potential short and long-term risk. This includes risk to human life, property, economic and social disruption. Through this update, we will be evaluating coastal hazards, which you'll see within the analysis, seismic and geologic hazards, flooding, fire, hazardous materials, aviation hazards, and extreme heat. So we've covered all of these topics with the subcommittee in more detail. And then the adopted element aims to protect residents, businesses, structures, infrastructure, and city functions, as well as to mitigate, prepare for, respond to, and recover from hazards. And that's still a priority for the update. So we're looking to address all of those things. We want to mitigate hazards where possible. We want to make sure that we are prepared for hazards so that we know how to address them when and if they occur. And then we want to be able to make sure that we are responding to those in a planned and appropriate way. And then in the event that a hazard does occur, we want to make sure that we're setting the framework so that we can recover and even thrive in that scenario. So some of the key considerations that we discussed with the subcommittee include the community demographics. So this was one of the first things that was brought up. If you're not familiar, the fastest growing population in Newport Beach is older adults. So seniors, those 65 years of age and older, you don't see any other groups that are actually growing in the projected future. So with that said, in the event that there's need for something like evacuation or even strong communication, we need to make sure that we're tailoring that in a way that it makes sense for the population. So one suggestion was potentially a buddy system of sorts, and I think that there's really some good ideas that came out of the discussion. Another thing that came up in terms of demographics is that first responders may not live in Newport Beach. So this does really tear more into a housing discussion, but it makes a lot of sense when you think in terms of you need people responding in the event of an emergency, and if they're living closer to you, then they can, of course, respond more quickly. One thing to note that, first responders in any emergency is always the fire department. Even with a 911 call, those are your first responders. So, at fire departments, you have firefighters that are living on site. So just one thing if you have concerns, to ease some of those concerns. Coastal hazards and erosion, again, this is a topic that it has come up in countless subcommittee meetings. It's come up with this GPAC, of course, and we will continue to have these discussions. This is clearly a priority. Coastal development and infrastructure is vulnerable to erosion, to flooding, to those sorts of hazards. There's a coordinated approach needed for private property, specifically as it relates to reduction of slope failure. So this really relates to thinking about existing properties where maybe they're not pulling a permit, so existing regulations may not be applying. How do we start to consider incentives to get those properties to make changes in a coordinated approach? This one was brought up, and we hadn't considered it, but groundwater intrusion from sea level rise is a concern, and this can impact the quality of groundwater. And a lot of the city's water use is from groundwater, so it's something that we need to consider to protect that resource at the end of the day. And then one of the key things we want to make sure that we're communicating when it comes to flooding, we speak in terms of 100-year storm events, also 500-year storm events. What these mean this is based on a chance of that storm occurring within a given year. So 100-year storm event has a 1% chance of occurring in a given year. And a 500-year storm event has a 0.2 chance of occurring within a given year. So that doesn't mean that if one happens this year, it won't happen next year. And this is data based on historic trends. So if these events do become more frequent, this terminology has not changed, but it's something that should be considered and could be potentially tracked locally to start to really develop those trends. And then coordination, again, this one continues to come up as well, but the note that hazards are cross-jurisdictional. So those partnerships can help share responsibility, they can increase capacity for responding to hazards, and can help improve effectiveness. So those interagency collaboration and coordination is really key. There was a mention of a need for Newport Beach Fire Department and the Orange County Fire Authority to coordinate better. So Newport Beach is not under the jurisdiction of the Orange County Fire Authority, but they have a lot of resources that they're putting out there, and there's a desire to start to coordinate with them a little bit better and share resources. There was a conversation around drone safety. Drone safety was brought up in terms of responding to fires as well as the airport. So some sort of a strategy for making sure that drones are addressed safely. There was also a desire to address hazard notification systems. So there was mention of sirens that go off in the event of like tsunami risk. But how do we start to capture that in more areas where a siren could be a notification system in the event of other hazards? And also other means of communication that the city uses at their disposal. And then the last thing, you know, this is really across all elements, I think, but there was discussion that, you know, AI could be used to help with tracking the implementation of the general plan as a whole. So this was through our safety conversation, but it really applies to the general plan. So with that, I will pass it off to Nancy.
On? Got it. Okay, thank you. That was a very thorough report. This document is long. When I asked if anybody had read it prior to the meeting, there were a few. So hopefully everybody gets a chance to read this. It's pretty important. Within the document, it does outline the laws that are required to be complied with. I found that interesting. In our meetings, we covered a lot of things which Elizabeth has already touched on, so I'm not going to go back through those. But in addition to that, we talked about the impact of sea level rise on development and whether or not we, if we want to focus on retreat or on mitigation. That was just brought up. We wanted to look at how other cities were dealing with how to mitigate those problems. One thing that came up that wasn't brought out, but I think it's covered. I checked all of these, and they did update the report, so we got it actually included in the final report. But one of the things was the interference of human interference in landscaping and how that affects slides and erosion. And we also talked about, we spent a lot of time talking about sea level rise. We talked about the seawater intrusion, saltwater intrusion. We talked about tracking storm events and how we could possibly use that information for future planning. We spent some time talking about fire hazards and the fire department's Class 1 rating and how that influences our homeowners insurance and the need to make that a more public knowledge so that people could tell their insurance companies. It's not something that the city can do, but individuals, if they're aware of it, they can affect their insurance rates by that. We talked about advanced air mobility in addition to drones. Some of the things that are coming are air taxis, and there is not a policy that will be heavily influenced by the FAA. We won't be able to really plan for it in the airport area, but when one of those lands at your neighbor's house in their driveway, delivering them home, you probably have something to say, or an opinion at least. So some things like that. We talked about extreme heat. We spent time talking about the demographics and older people not being able to tolerate the heat as well. In this city in particular, in some of the older neighborhoods, homes are not air conditioned, so we have an older population who doesn't deal with heat, and they're living in an older home that doesn't have an air conditioner. You know, how do we deal with that? Probably in terms of code, not in terms of buying them an air conditioner. We talked about how to incentivize people to upgrade their properties with some things that could help mitigate those problems. And then we spent time talking about communication and the new methods that the city of Newport Beach is using, the Nixle. And those things all did get incorporated into the revised background report, so I think that we're covered there. I did want to point out that the place that demographic information came from, I found extremely interesting. I don't have time to read these before the meetings. I don't read every other committee's reports, but as I have time, I've been able to get through some of them. The plan, the background report for resilience, recreation and natural resources because of planning for parks, they had a great chart on demographics for the age of population, and I was astonished to see that in 2045 the demographics reduce for children under 24 by 3,000 people, young workers 25 to 35 or 1,100 people reduction, family formation groups, which is 35 to 54, reduced by 183. Empty nesters, 55 to 74, only reduced by 40. That's not very much. Over 75 increases by 7,782 people. That's what we expect to have here in Newport Beach. I was shocked to hear that, and I think it affects every single one of these elements. So I thought it was interesting. You can find it if you're interested to refer to it. It is in the natural resources, but it made me realize how important it is that we do actually review this information that they're putting together for us, because there are some hidden gems in here that you wouldn't know exist. Thank you. That's my.
Thanks, Nancy. Thanks, Elizabeth. Any questions? Let's start with you, Dennis, please.
Okay, so one of the things that wasn't mentioned, but maybe you did discuss it, are lifeguards. So our lifeguards are part of the fire department in our case, and we don't quite surround them, but we have another lifeguard service, which is a state service, which is in Crystal Cove. And so I don't know if there might be something in there about coordination between. It happens that their offices are right next to each other at the sheriff's department, so I'm sure they talk to each other, and the state houses their boats at the docks down there. But I think it would be something good. And then another thing regarding the lifeguards, I don't know that it's unique, but I think our junior lifeguard program is a great feeder into our lifeguards. So there was our lifeguards, so many of our lifeguards that end up being professional lifeguards come out of that junior lifeguard program way ahead because they're familiar, that is their home turf and everything else. So I think that might be something that would be appropriate to weave in there somehow, that we actually have that program feeding into it. Those are my two comments on that.
That's great, and we didn't talk about either one of those, so thank you.
Thank you. Charles, please.
Hi there. I'm on that committee, but I wasn't able to attend that meeting. Under communication and coordination, I'd like to recommend that the city consider an alternate communication system besides land-based internet in the event of a disaster, something like Starlink as a backup. I'm not aware that we have a backup communication system beyond land-based at this point. Thanks.
Thank you, Charles. I'll come back to you, Lynn.
Testing. Chuck Vancher, resident. 3 comments, if I may, using Elizabeth's screen. On the 100-year storm event, it's consensus in the engineering side of the world and the environmental side of the world that the 100-year storm means nothing now. It does not mean what it used to be. To use that term and think that it's going to happen as a 1% chance of it is ill-founded. And I think as we address that topic in our writings, we should be careful not to continue that outdated notion. I don't know how you talk about it differently, but it's literally the case where 100-year events now, Mr. Webb, David Webb, will probably think it's going to happen 5 times a year. I mean, that's been my discussion with him, is that these are recurring events. They're not sometimes occurring events. The second thing, a quick thing, and Nancy touched on drone safety. I forget the 2 items that you mentioned where drones come into play, but they were limited in their impacts. I mean, we're in our horizon is that drones will be in every neighborhood every day, as Nancy touches on. And, our city needs to determine how it views that prospect. It's not just a flight, the FAA consideration, it's our community considerations. Some people might be for it because it's just convenient. Others may not like it. So that's a comment on that. My last comment is on the idea of tracking storm activity. The factor that probably has more relevance to us in the city, a coastal city in terms of sea rise, is tracking flooding. And this is something that It's difficult to do. We have discussed this, or I have at the water quality committee with the city utilities head and Dave Webb, asking if we could make that something that reports to the water quality committee. And they say it's difficult to do it, but it tells the story. And it was that story that led to the city's focus on Balboa Island, because they could see the flooding happening changing overnight. And if we track where flooding's happening, we'll see where sea rise is hitting us. So that's just a refinement, Nancy, on the topic of tracking storms.
Thank you, Chuck. All right, Lynn, please.
Just as it relates to demographic and affordability, I think it probably is no surprise that those two are related, by the fact that what coastal, not just Newport Beach, but what coastal city, what it costs to live in a coastal city. And I think a lot of our older residents have also been living here for a long time. And we should also factor in the job market and where the talent, as far as younger people, where are they going to go to get the highest paying jobs? And they may not be finding those jobs here in Orange County. So that's a much bigger picture. But going back to the safety element, I mentioned this a while back, but I'm curious if we're going to pull in the city's CERT program and the partnership with FEMA. I mean, there's a lot of resources there that we're not tapping into, and it's barely, I don't even know that it's mentioned in this documentation. But just as an example, I know at Bayside Village and Marina, where I live, we have a robust CERT program by which we engage our residents, and we do have a buddy system. We have block captains that once a year go out and get everybody's information. They make sure that we know if there's somebody on oxygen. Does somebody have a boat with a generator? Does somebody have a golf cart that could transport injured people? And we go by the assumption that nobody's going to come and help us because we're by a bridge. There's a lot of things factored into that. And so we've invested in a little command post. We are spending money on a defibrillator. We've got, to your point, Charles, we've got like a, not two-way radio, but what's the, like a CB radio, and we've got several people that are trained and have their licenses in that. So anyway, point being is that maybe what we need to look at as part of this element is more community outreach and engagement as it relates to an existing CERT program that's been in place for a very long time. There's training. It's it's such an amazing resource, so that people are able to help themselves in the event of more likely an earthquake or, God forbid, an airline disaster.
Thank you, Lynn. Good points. David, please.
Just to echo that, what you say, Lynn, I'm part of that CERT communication program, so to also echo what Charles was saying, amateur radio, I think, should also be part of that because it's not dependent on satellites, it's not dependent on electricity, it's not dependent on anything. So you should also put amateur radio in there as well.
Thanks, David. I would say self-driving cars, too. That's the next one. Maybe before the flying ones. Jim, please.
Yeah, I may have missed it, but one topic that impacts both noise and safety is roadway speeds. And people driving slower is safer and quieter, but of course takes longer to get to where you're going. And for a long time, that was thought to be a topic that was kind of off the table because we were told that the state required us to set all of the speed limits on our streets to whatever speed people were driving at. But I understand now that the law on that has changed 2 years ago. And just last week, the city of Anaheim City Council voted to reduce speed limits on many of their streets. So perhaps that's a topic, if that is now something negotiable, that we would want to do some outreach on, whether that's a controversial topic or something people think would be good or bad to lower speed limits now that we have that, and what kind of the future policy should be on that.
Thanks, Jim. Nancy.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And the other thing that came up after this that I just briefly mentioned was a study of sidewalks in I would say this gal was talking specifically about the peninsula, but I would think that that would apply to any neighborhoods that are around schools where you have a lot of little kids, or parks where you have traffic. I think that she had a really good point. The city did do a survey of traffic sidewalk safety in like 2 or 3 locations on the peninsula, 2 or 3 different sidewalks crossings, but not every one of those. And in this case, the place where the accident happened, of course, involved a person who was drinking. That's a little out of the unusual, but there might be a suggestion in here to do those kinds of surveys on a regular basis as our population moves from one place to another. So.
Yeah, I think one other item to add with that, and maybe it was discussed in another committee, is the multimodal and what does that mean to safety, whether that's bikes, electric bikes, other boards. I mean, you name it, it'll eventually be self-driving cars. Yeah, that'll come. But just multimodal beyond just a bus, right? I think there's many modes of transportation.
And the circulation element is being updated with the new bike policy. I don't know, are we going to hear that here? No, we're not? No, they're working on it right now. The new bicycle, will it come before this committee? Okay, so there'll be a study session, but yeah, okay. That's a good point. Thank you.
Thanks, Nancy. Any other items? Charles, please.
To Jim's point, the city of Costa Mesa is promoting increased bicycle or whatever mode you're riding on mobility, and they have also, like Anaheim, reduced the speed limit on streets in support of the sharing the street with bicycles.
Thanks, Charles. One more.
One more communication vehicle that we hadn't thought about is also Neighborhood Watch, and using Neighborhood Watch as a vehicle for spreading news or having people in your neighborhood that are trained to handle things in case of emergency, a point of contact.
Thank you. Okay, any other comments on that? All right, so we've received the report. Thank you, Nancy, and thank you, Elizabeth. They'll continue to provide us updates on that, but we'll receive and file that attachment 4 as we talked about. Now we'll turn it to one of our last items on the agenda, which is presentation by Elizabeth on the overview of upcoming deliverables and objectives.
Thank you. I'll be brief. And Kearns and West is the outreach consultant on this, but they are out for Juneteenth today, so I'm reporting. So Battle in the Bay was mentioned. This was a really successful pop-up outreach event. Thanks to all who attended, and thank you to Laird for all of his work helping get that event happening. And then thank you also to Amber for all of her work in bringing so many people over to talk with us. I felt like Amber really showed a great example of the role that members of the GPAC can play at an outreach event. And even if you don't want to facilitate the discussion, if you just bring your friends over and make them talk to us, they're willing to share a lot more. So thank you for that. We engaged with about 110 people, including passing out the QR code cards, which will absolutely work to get those to everyone. And then some of the key themes that we heard were maintaining the character of the bay and the harbor, improving water quality, and continuing to host community events and recreational activities. So that programming is really important to the community. Since we last reported out, as of June 10th, website engagement has had a total of 5,412 views, and the contributions to both the questionnaire and the interactive map have doubled. So we've been getting a lot more activity on the website. And then next steps. So we are going to be working closely with the outreach subcommittee. We are working on an outreach summary for phase 1 outreach, which includes the pop-up events. It includes the steering committees that we've been working with, and we'll be working with the subcommittee to get that into a document that is really easily digestible to the community, because we we've got all the meeting minutes, we've got all the detail available to people if they want to dive into it, but we want this to be a document that people can pick up, and it feels a little bit fun if they want to get involved in the process. We'll also be working with the Outreach Subcommittee on the Go to Them meetings, and it sounds like some of those are already in the works. Some are going to be getting on the Harbor Commission's agenda. And then, of course, developing the Phase 2 outreach. We're also going to be going to the Noise Subcommittee. DUDEC has an acoustician working on a memo that reviews the existing noise element. So we'll be tying that up and bringing that to the Noise Subcommittee. And then our next reports to the GPAC will include the diagnostic memo, which I know some of you were hoping that that would really build off the housing one. We're not addressing housing in that diagnostic memo, but there's a lot of other laws that apply, either directly or indirectly, and we're breaking it all down because, again, we're starting fresh. So even laws that have been addressed through your adopted element, we're addressing them again. And then as well, the implementation program analysis, where if you really want the most detail on implementation, that's through the city's general plan annual progress reports. That's where you get the most detail. We're not going to recap those. We're going to give a little bit of a different context of just an assessment and really that overview of the general plan itself. So with that, that is all I have.
Thank you. I'll add too that Nancy and Debbie and I went to the Corona Del Mar one, which was a lot of fun. We had the Newport Beach Police Department out there. I thought it was pretty funny. They were giving away donuts, but we had a good time out there. So I thought it was very productive. Any other comments? Yes, please, Paul.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. Does this group or does the city have a strategy as to what is going to happen on November 5th? And is there any intention to try to sell the vote on the 5th? Does the city have any thoughts as to how they're going to handle it? And if they don't, should we?
That has been discussed. First of all, the city can provide information, it cannot provide cheerleading, is my understanding. That I asked a council member, is there a plan B? And first of all, what are we going to do? There will be an interesting meeting, I think, on July 23rd when they come to this, because there has been some discussion about whether there actually does need to be a ballot measure or not. And I do not know. I know there have been various legal opinions on that provided to different people. But it's the council's decision. And if they decide to put it on the ballot, then I'm assuming that the council, as individuals and that GPAC and everything, we will talk about it then as to what the policy is. But I know the city itself cannot be doing anything but say they can provide information.
Okay, good question. Any other comments, questions? Nancy?
Elizabeth, on the diagnostic memo, will you be addressing laws that affect the land use element as it does not apply to the housing element for the rest of the land use? Will that be part of it?
Yes, that's accurate. I want to say that there was one that there is overlap, of course, but I tried not to get into the weeds on housing because it's just not necessary. And there's been more than 100 housing bills adopted since 2017.
Thank you. Jim, please.
Yeah. Is it possible to expand a little more on what the Phase 2 outreach might be? And specifically, if you noticed my comment that I submitted yesterday, calling the committee's attention to the survey being conducted by the Orange County, which seemed to be much more meatier, I guess, than our current one. So in Phase 2, are we going to be putting online a survey like that? And is the committee going to have input so that the various subcommittees will have questions asked to address the problems they want answers to?
So in short, we'll be working with the outreach subcommittee to develop the phase 2 outreach. I know that we will, because phase 2 is more in depth, we'll be going into more depth in terms of the types of outreach that we're doing. So that will include things like workshops and the go-to-them meetings and more targeted outreach versus the kind of broad visioning outreach. But whether or not we'll have another survey, I think that's a great question, and we'll have that discussion with outreach subcommittee.
I vaguely recall there was such a survey circulated by mail in the last general plan update. And I thought it was useful for everybody in the city to have a chance to provide their answers to questions like this.
Thanks, Jim. Any other comments? Susan.
Just following up on Jim's comment, if you're during phase 2, you're intending to go to them, to different organizations, it seems like a perfect opportunity to incorporate some surveys that are relevant to them with input from the subcommittees. So it's just a suggestion. The other question I had was, what's going to happen during July? Will there be additional subcommittee meetings?
So the only subcommittee meeting that, or the two meetings that I think could potentially happen are for outreach and for the noise subcommittee. There are no other subcommittee meetings planned. The diagnostic memo and the implementation program analysis are more overarching and broad sweeping. It wouldn't make sense to meet individually on those in the subcommittees. So those will likely be distributed to the entire GPAC for consideration well in advance of your next meeting, which that's one thing I would like to have the chairs facilitate is when the next meeting will occur. As you know, the first Wednesday of July is very close to the 4th of July holiday, and I don't think that many of you would want to meet that day. So would make a suggestion to move that to July 17th. Sorry to take your conversation to a different topic, but I wanted to make sure that we get that out for the record.
Well, I think that is relevant because you need to have enough time in advance of the meeting on the 17th, if that's the date. I did want to request at an appropriate time that there be another meeting of the Land Use Subcommittee that would focus on the specific target areas that we've discussed, prioritizing the airport area and Newport Center for identifying some goals and policies that would guide a specific plan for those two areas. So it doesn't have to be before the July 17th meeting, if that's the date. It could be afterwards, but I just wanted to put it on the table.
Noted. Thank you, Chair.
Okay, thank you. Ben, do you think we should send out like a poll, doodle poll or something? And we'll give some options to the group so we can figure that out. Okay, but we promise it will not be on July 3rd. So you know that. Alrighty, thanks, Susan. Any other comments? Okay, last item on the agenda is any committee announcements or matters we want to put on the next agenda other than the beaches thing that we talked about. Anything else? None. Well, with that being said, meeting adjourned. All right, thank you.
An update steering committee. And if you would, we have another meeting, ladies. If you would like to carry on your conversation, thank you. We would like to get started because we've had already a pretty good evening. Please show that all of our steering committee members are here. Public comments on non-agenda items. Are there any public comments, Chuck?
Hello. Thank you, Nancy. in your advisory committee meeting just held, Chuck Fancher, Newport Beach resident, Dennis Baker raised an interesting question to Elizabeth, and that is, does the general plan update have legal standing? Discussion unfolded, and that it may not have the standing of codified zoning law and ordinance, but if there's conflict between the two, there could be a fight. I think back to all the city council agendas that I've attended and I read as I've attended the meetings, and usually in each of the items, there's a certification by the city attorney or city clerk that might speak to something like CEQA. This matter doesn't require CEQA review. It's a very standard provision, and it may not. Jim, do you know what I'm talking about? Does it come to mind? Is it CEQA? Is that the one? I think it would be well if the general plan update group were to suggest and request as part of what it gives to the city council, that it become a policy that in any matter before the council that falls under the subject matter of the land use plan, that there is a statement that the matter is consistent with the city's recommendation, is consistent with the land use general plan, the update. No differently than we address CEQA. And that way it would then have to point out, the city attorney would have to point out an inconsistency, and that would cause the public's attention to be given to where the council was trying to implement something that was inconsistent with the general plan update, which should have value. So I pose it for thinking purposes.
All right, thank you. Any comments? Staff, you have any comment on that? All right. Any other public comments on non-agenda items? All right, the meeting minutes of our previous meeting, I have a motion to approve. Motion to approve. Seconded. Second, all right. There. Any corrections, additions? No, all right. We are all three present at the GPAC meeting, so we did have the presentations. Do you feel a need for a repetition of any of that? All right, so let me ask you, do you have any comments of your own on the land use subcommittee? Okay.
Hi. Mm-hmm. So my one question is, how does the land use general plan overlay, and actually there's some crossover too with like the safety and even the harbor, beaches harbor, how does that overlay with the local coastal program? Because my guess is things like erosion and any sort of natural conditions are addressed and updated by the Coastal Commission as well. And I don't know if that's the case, but I would think there's a state plan on top of our plan, and just wondered how they interplayed, if at all.
Yeah, that's a great question, Committee Member Carter. I would say that the local coastal program for the city, which is certified, does provide a policy framework to help guide development and access, recreation, protection of coastal resources within the coastal zone in a broad manner. So the hope would be that the general plan policies sort of fold in nicely already with those pre-existing policies in the coastal land use plan and the local coastal program itself. That said, if there are updates needed to support and furtherance of the general plan policies that are made, let's say the land use element, that could be carried forward into the coastal land use plan for consistency's sake, and would be vetted through the California Coastal Commission to make sure that they have concurrence with those changes.
So they're doing it on a local basis. They're not pushing down any sort of broader requirements on all coastal cities.
Well, there are requirements such as was mentioned, the sea level rise and vulnerability assessments. Those are being pushed on cities and things that we'll be completing. But yes, the city does have our own certified plan, but that does get vetted through the Coastal Commission to make sure that it complies and is in furtherance with the Coastal Act in general. So there's always that checks and balance approach.
Philip, any comments?
So Benjamin and I talked earlier. I have a lot of questions. I'm not going to bore the group with it. One quick question. When it comes to non-conforming uses, given that we're doing overlays, do we anticipate any issues being created by that? Or because we're doing overlays, we don't see that happening? Okay. That was one. Another thing in the general plan, let's see, we reference policy 4.4, and unless I'm missing it, I didn't see a 4.4.
So 4.4 is included in the draft policy language that is implementing the housing element. So it's not a current policy, that's a proposed policy.
And when will that be?
So that is actually a document that has been drafted and has made it through Planning Commission for recommendation, and that's the item that's going to the City Council in July.
That's all I have for right now.
Public comment?
I think to Phil's question about incompatible uses, there may be no problem at the moment about the overlays, but I think there's been a question of whether the overlays will exist forever into the future or eventually go away, or how that's going to happen. So at some point, the current ones, which are very specific to this housing element, you would think would get phased out, and then at that point, that issue may arise of how the overlay is phased out, if it ever has to be. So,
Wasn't there some language about sunsetting in the land use element?
I think the question Mr. Mosier has touches upon if the overlays go away and you've got residential development that's happened, are you now creating a non-conforming use? And that's something that I wouldn't say we've thought of thoughtfully right now, but I would anticipate that the land use pattern will somehow be updated to recognize what is developed in the field, such that we're not creating nonconformities in the future. Because to your point, I do not anticipate that the overlays would be on the books in perpetuity, so to speak.
Any other comments on the land use report? All right. Moving on to the Harbor and Bay Subcommittee. Comments from the steering committee? Comments from the public? All right, and then the Safety Subcommittee. Again. Philip?
I don't know if this is germane or not, but given the way various cities are having difficulties with crime, retail theft, all of those things, does that element ever creep in, or is that specific to laws of the city?
That's a good question. I don't know. Elizabeth, do you have insight on that? I don't want to just put you on the spot, but
I'm sorry, did you say retail theft?
like crime, theft, robberies, is that typically included in a safety element? Is that something you've seen?
Actually, we have seen crime be addressed in safety elements. We actually have seen crime be addressed in older safety elements, because a lot of the time the language that you see around those policies can be a little bit concerning. So I think if crime is something that the community does want to address in the safety element, we want to be really thoughtful about that language and what the issues really are and what sort of policies we could put in place. But we've certainly seen it addressed in safety elements. It's not being addressed so much recently updated safety elements.
And were they addressed, I can see generally like supporting the police, or, I mean, strong police force or presence or something, or were they more specific? Do you remember?
In some contexts, they're specific. You see things around graffiti and things like that.
Oh, I mean, I to your point, hearing about all of the different boats that are showing up on the docks, and I don't know that there's anything you can do about that in a general plan, though, right? I mean, same with retail theft. I don't know how the general plan would address that, if at all.
Are you seeming to hint that it's something we shouldn't address because there's too many issues that would take place if we try to, and we're going to miss it?
No, I actually think that we would just want to be thoughtful about identifying the issues and then identifying the opportunities. So one thing that I'm thinking in terms of crime and like design, for example, is we can think about crime prevention through environmental design and incorporating policies related to that. That's about increasing visibility, things like that to kind of illuminate areas, get rid of like shrubbery and things that could be blocking areas. So there's policy that could be tailored around that. But I think that we just want to be like think in terms about what the issues are.
Well, I think that's something we have the chair of the subcommittee here, and you might bring it up and see if they want to explore that in any way. Anything else from this committee? All right, anything from the public comment on safety? Committee announcements? All right, then, we are adjourned. Thank you all.
Thank you.